A quiet beginning before the storm. The lecture hall of Harrison State University always had a certain stillness before the first class of the semester. The polished wooden seats gleamed under the soft yellow lights, and the tall arched windows kept the early morning sun respectfully muted. Students slowly filtered in, some tired, some curious, some simply trying to make it through another required course. But no one really knew what awaited them today. At exactly 9 a.m., Professor Daniel Carter walked into the hall. He wasn't famous for his books, nor for political activism, nor for awards. He was loved and sometimes feared because he had a way of making seemingly ordinary ideas feel as if they carried the weight of life itself. He was tall, with graying hair at the temples, a calm voice, and eyes that looked as though they could read a person's thoughts before the person even spoke. In his hands, he carried no notes, no laptop, only a white piece of chalk. "Good morning," he said softly. Yet somehow, his greeting filled the entire room. The students murmured a half-awake response. Daniel Carter smiled faintly, as though everything was going exactly as he expected. "Welcome," he began, "to a journey that will probably unsettle you, confuse you, perhaps even disturb you. And still, I promise you, it will awaken something inside you that you may not have touched before." The students straightened in their seats. "You enrolled in this course because its title is simple, justice. But justice, real justice, is anything but simple." He walked toward the center of the stage and stopped. "And because justice begins with choices, let's begin with one." He didn't write anything on the board. He didn't project anything on the screen. He simply looked at them and said, "Imagine yourself behind the controls of a train." A hush fell over the room.
"You are the driver," Daniel said, "of a heavy trolley barreling down the tracks at 60 miles per hour. The brakes fail, the horn fails, the radio fails. You have seconds, only seconds, to make a decision." The students watched him intently. At the end of the track, 5 workers are repairing the rails. They don't hear you. They don't see you. You know, without doubt, that if the trolley continues its path, all 5 will die. He paused. "But there is a side track, and on that track is 1 worker." The class shifted, uncomfortable already. "Yes," Daniel said gently, "you can turn the wheel. You can divert the trolley. You can save 5 by sacrificing 1. He took a deep breath and asked, "What do you do?" Hands rose slowly, hesitantly. Most chose to turn the trolley. A few refused. Daniel nodded, absorbing their choices, then asked the real question. "Why?" A student named Emily Foster, sitting near the front, spoke first. Her voice trembled a little, the way a person's voice does when they know the problem is heavier than their words. "It feels wrong," she said, "to let 5 people die when I can save them, even if it means someone else dies. I would rather live knowing 1 life was lost instead of 5. Another student, Jason Reed, added, "It's just math. 5 is more than 1. But then from the back row, Marcus Blake, a quiet student with thoughtful eyes, raised his hand. "What if turning the trolley means you become responsible for killing someone?" he asked. "Before your decision, the trolley was out of control. But once you turn the wheel, the death of that one person becomes your deliberate action." A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. "Exactly," Professor Carter said. "So now we face a deeper question. Are we responsible only for our actions, or also for our inactions?" The room grew heavier. "Which is more painful?" Daniel asked. "To know that people died because you did nothing? Or to know that someone died because you chose something?" Silence. "But we're not done," he whispered. "Not even close. The second blow when saving 5 feels like murder." Daniel walked to the very edge of the stage. His voice softened, but its intensity only grew. "Let me give you a second scenario." The students leaned forward. "This time you're not the trolley driver. You're a bystander standing on a bridge overlooking the tracks." He lifted his hand, painting the picture in the air. "The same trolley is coming. The same 5 workers will die. But this time, there is no sidetrack." A few students exhaled nervously. "But next to you," Daniel continued, "leans a large man, a man heavy enough that if you push him off the bridge, he will fall onto the track. He will stop the trolley. He will die. The 5 workers will live." Gasps, whispers. Daniel didn't smile. He didn't blink. "Would you push him?" This time, hardly any hands rose. Daniel folded his arms. So he said softly, "What changed?" Emily shook her head. "It feels cruel. Too direct. It's like killing someone with my own hands." Marcus spoke again. "But isn't the result the same? One dies, 5 live." "Right," said Daniel. "But the act feels different, doesn't it?" Heads nodded. "And this," Daniel said, "is where philosophy begins, not with answers, but with the discomfort of our contradictions." He turned and finally wrote one word on the board. Why? Why are we willing to turn a wheel that kills someone, but not willing to push a man to save those same people? What is the moral difference between turning a handle and using our hands? Is it intent? Is it proximity? Is it emotional cost? Or something deeper? The students didn't know. Not yet. The unsettling awakening. Where philosophy truly begins. Professor Carter stepped back from the board and watched his students. Some looked troubled, some confused, some intrigued. But all were awake now. Truly awake in a way no coffee could achieve. This, Daniel said, is the beginning of your journey. This discomfort is your first step. He walked slowly across the stage, his voice lower, warmer. You see, justice isn't about memorizing laws or repeating theories. It's about confronting the choices that tear at your soul and asking what it means to be human. He pointed toward the students gently. Every one of you already lives by a moral code, whether you realize it or not. You make choices, big and small, every single day. But today, for the first time, you are seeing the cracks in your own thinking. That is not a sign of weakness. It is the birth of wisdom. Some students lowered their eyes, thoughtful. Daniel continued, There are 2 great paths in moral philosophy. The first believes that morality lies in the results, that the greatest happiness for the greatest number is the right choice. This is the path of those who turn the trolley. He paused. And then there is the second path. This one says that some actions are just wrong, no matter what result they bring. This path belongs to those who refuse to push the man from the bridge. He let the silence hold for a moment. Over the next weeks, we will walk both paths. We will question them, and challenge ourselves. You will doubt what you thought you knew. You will argue. You will change your mind. You will resist change. You will feel lost. And then slowly you will begin to find yourself. He smiled gently. Welcome to the restlessness of reason. With that, the class bell rang, but not a single student stood up. They sat still as though the world had shifted just slightly beneath their feet. And maybe it had, when the classroom turns into a battlefield of thoughts. The second lecture began on a windy Thursday morning. Leaves rushed across the courtyard like hurried messengers, and the sky carried that pale silver color that announces winter is near inside the huge lecture hall. The students were louder today, more alive, as though Professor Carter's first class had shaken, something buried deep inside them. But when Daniel Carter entered, silence followed him like a loyal companion. He placed a small leather notebook on the desk, its edges worn out, its pages yellowed with years of use. Perhaps it held secrets of lectures past or questions he had asked other students decades ago. No one knew. Last time, he began, we took our first step into the maze of moral reasoning. Today we take the second, and it is darker. The temperature of the room seemed to shift. He looked around as though reading each student's unspoken thoughts. Some of you, he continued, went home unsettled. That is good. If you slept peacefully after the trolley problem, then you were not listening closely enough. Soft chuckles broke the tension. But today, Daniel said, the choices become harder. Because today's question is not about what you would do. It is about who you are willing to become. He opened his notebook slowly. We begin with a true story. The room froze. This is not fiction, not a thought experiment, not a hypothetical. This happened in the brutal honesty of real life. He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. It is the case of State of Florida versus Thomas Hale, 1987. Dozens of pens clicked open. It begins, Daniel said in a steady voice on a quiet beach after a storm. The shipwreck that broke more than a boat. In July of 1987, Daniel continued, a small private fishing vessel named the Artemis capsized during a sudden storm off the coast of Key Largo. The crew of 4 men, Thomas Hale, Robert Mitchell, Eric Johnson, and a 17-year-old boy named Caleb Moore, were thrown into the raging sea. The students leaned in. For 30 hours, they clung to a broken piece of the hull, fighting cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Daniel's voice softened. And then, the worst truth of human survival revealed itself. They had no food. No fresh water. No rescue in sight. He shut his notebook. After 30 hours, the youngest, Caleb, began slipping into unconsciousness. Several students looked down, shifting uneasily. The other three debated, argued, cried, begged God for another option. But no option came. Daniel's words fell like stones. And so sometime near dawn, they made a choice. No one breathed. They decided that the only way for three to survive was for one to die. A girl in the front row covered her mouth. Caleb was the weakest, the youngest, the one least likely to make it. And so Thomas Hale slit his wrist quickly, quietly. The three men drank his blood to stay alive. They cut strips of muscle from his arms. And so they survived long enough for the Coast Guard to find them. A heavy, suffocating silence spread across the lecture hall. Daniel did not spare them. When they were rescued, the authorities discovered what had happened. Hale was charged with murder. The other two were charged as accomplices. He stepped closer to the students. The defense argued they acted out of necessity. The prosecution argued that no one has the right to kill an innocent boy, even to save others. He raised his eyes to the class. You are the jury. A wave of tension rippled across the room. Do you convict Thomas Hale of murder? He asked quietly. Or do you set him free? A few hands rose slightly, but Daniel lifted his hand to stop them. No, not yet. First, we understand the moral battlefield beneath this choice. The furnace of moral philosophy starts to ignite. Daniel took a slow breath and continued. There are two moral worlds colliding here. He wrote on the board, one, consequences, dos, principles. Consequences tell us that 3 lives are more valuable than 1. That survival is worth the price of an unchosen sacrifice. That saving many is better than losing all. He circled the word consequences. This is the logic that persuaded so many of you to turn the trolley in the first scenario. Then he wrote under principles. Some acts are wrong no matter the outcome. Some lives cannot be taken for convenience. Some actions stain the soul beyond repair. He turned back to the class. Ask yourselves, if you free Thomas Hale, what are you saying? That in impossible situations, killing is justified? That necessity erases morality? That principle can die if circumstances demand? The students shifted, uneasy. Emily raised her hand. Professor, it sounds terrifying, but I don't think I can convict him. They would have all died. What choice did he have? Daniel nodded. And if you acquit him, he said, are you prepared for the door you open? What if tomorrow someone kills because they claim it was necessary? What if someone sacrifices another person in the name of survival? Efficiency or convenience? Jason leaned forward. But morality can't ignore survival. If we criminalize everything in desperate situations, we force people to die instead of choosing the lesser evil. Ah, Daniel said gently. The lesser evil. He wrote those words on the board. Whenever you say lesser evil, you admit the act is still evil. Just smaller? Marcus raised his hand. Professor, is there a difference between choosing to kill and choosing not to die? Daniel paused. This time he didn't answer immediately. That, he said at last, is the question philosophers have argued for centuries. Does nature's cruelty excuse our own? Does fear justify harm? Does desperation erase guilt? He stepped toward the center of the stage. And most haunting of all, is surviving worth becoming a person who killed to survive? The student swallowed hard. Because that question felt different. Personal. Dark. Uncomfortably real. The storm inside us and the mirror philosophy holds up. Daniel closed his notebook again, this time more slowly. There is something else, he said. Something deeper than law, deeper than logic. He placed both hands on the desk, leaning forward. When the survivors were rescued, they were crying, not out of relief but out of shame. Thomas Hale himself told the court, I lived through the storm, but something inside me died that night. A rustle went through the room like a collective shiver. Human beings, Daniel said softly, are not calculators. We don't weigh lives the way we weigh coins. We feel the weight of what we decide. We carry it. Sometimes forever. He walked toward the first row. And that is where law struggles. Law can measure actions. Law can define crimes. But law cannot measure the cost of survival on the human soul. He stepped back and addressed the entire room with a quiet intensity. You see, philosophy doesn't hand you answers. It forces you to stand in the storm yourself. It asks you to confront the kind of person you would be when life strips away comfort, safety, and certainty. He looked at Emily. At what point does survival become selfishness? He looked at Jason. At what point does necessity become violence? He looked at Marcus. At what point does choice become guilt? Then he lifted his voice just slightly. And at what point do you say, my principles matter more than my life? Silence. He didn't let them escape the weight of the moment. Some philosophers believe that morality ends where survival begins. Others believe that morality becomes most real precisely when survival is threatened. He pointed gently at the entire class. You will decide which side you belong to. He stepped back, letting the tension settle. This is not just a court case, not just a philosophical story. It is a mirror. He turned the lights a little dimmer, just enough to let the mood settle deeper. And when you look into that mirror, you may not like everything you see. The bell rang. No one moved. Professor Carter closed his notebook and said in a calm, almost tender voice, Next class, we explore what the law did. But for now, ask yourself what you would have done. This answer will not come easily, and that is exactly why it matters. He left the hall. But the silence he left behind seemed almost alive. The surgeon's impossible choice. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Harrison State University, casting long stripes of light across the lecture hall. Students shuffled in, some clutching notebooks, others staring into the distance, still haunted by the dilemmas from the previous lectures. The weight of yesterday's choices, the trolley, the fat man, the bridge, hung over the room like a quiet storm. Professor Daniel Carter entered the room without a word. His steps were deliberate, each footfall echoing faintly in the hushed space. He set down a small wooden box on the desk and looked at the students with calm intensity. Today, he said, we enter a space where morality is not only tested but shattered and rebuilt in our minds. We move from hypothetical choices to ones that feel as if they could happen in our lives or perhaps have already happened silently, somewhere far from here. He picked up a piece of chalk, paused, and wrote on the board, Life versus life. Imagine, he continued, you are a transplant surgeon. In the hospital, there are 5 patients, each in desperate need of a different organ. One needs a heart, another a lung, another a kidney, the 4th a liver, and the 5th a pancreas. Without these organs, each will die. The students leaned forward, some unconsciously gripping their desks. And then, Daniel said, you notice in the next room a healthy young man. He came in for a routine checkup, completely unaware of the lives hanging in the balance. If you take his organs, all 5 patients can survive. But the young man will die. A wave of murmurs ran through the hall. A few students gasped. The ethical tension was almost physical. Who would do it? Daniel asked softly. No one raised their hand. You see, he said, voice lowering, this is where our moral intuitions become a storm. What we accepted in the trolley, scenario sacrificing 1 to save 5, feels unbearable here. Why does proximity, intent, or involvement change our judgment so radically? Marcus Blake, sitting near the back, finally spoke, his voice tentative. It's different because the person isn't already in danger. You would be choosing to make him a victim, not just divert a fate that was already set in motion. Exactly, Daniel said. The moral weight of direct action versus indirect consequence begins to reveal itself. Our ethics are not merely about numbers. They are about the story behind each life, each heartbeat, the lessons and consequences. Daniel moved to the center of the hall, his hands folded behind him. Yesterday, we glimpsed 2 modes of moral reasoning, consequentialist ethics, where the rightness of an action is judged by its outcomes, and categorical ethics, where some actions are deemed wrong regardless of their results. He paused, letting the students digest this. Consequentialism, the doctrine of utility, asks, does this action maximize happiness or minimize suffering? In the trolley case, turning the wheel seems justified. 5 lives saved, 1 lost. The math is simple. The emotion, much more complex. Emily Foster, sitting in the front row, raised her hand. But Professor, when it comes to the organ case, it feels wrong to take an innocent life, even for 5 others. Why? Daniel nodded. A perceptive question. Here, categorical morality intervenes. Philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that some acts are intrinsically wrong. To use a human being as a mere means to an end, even a noble end, is morally impermissible. The pain of taking that young man's organs is not outweighed by the lives saved because morality is not always reducible to arithmetic. He turned to the blackboard, writing slowly. Ends do not justify all means. Philosophy, he continued, teaches us not to escape from these dilemmas but to confront them fully. To see the tension, to live with the unrest of our reason. Marcus leaned back. So it's okay to feel torn? Daniel smiled faintly. More than okay. It is necessary. The real journey begins when we admit that there may not be a clear answer, but the struggle itself shapes our moral understanding, from theory to life, when philosophy meets reality. The morning light spilled into the lecture hall, catching the dust particles like tiny golden stars. Students filed in quietly, each carrying notebooks, pens, and a lingering tension from the previous discussions. Yesterday's scenarios, the trolley, the bridge, the transplant, were still alive in their minds. They had argued, hesitated, and felt the weight of morality pressing on their shoulders. Professor Daniel Carter walked in, his presence calm but commanding. No notes, no slides, just his gaze sweeping across the room. "Good morning," he said softly, but each word seemed to resonate with a deeper significance. Over the last few lectures, we have explored the abstract, hypothetical dilemmas, moral thought experiments, and philosophical principles. Today, we turn to the real world, where justice, ethics, and consequence collide with messy human lives. He paused, letting the words settle. Some students scribbled notes. Others stared blankly, absorbing every syllable. Imagine for a moment you are a policymaker, a judge, a teacher, or simply a citizen faced with difficult choices. The decisions are rarely clean, rarely clear, and often the stakes are far higher than any classroom exercise could convey. He walked slowly to the front row. Consider affordable healthcare, criminal justice, or military conscription. Each decision affects lives, often in ways that cannot be undone. Your moral intuitions, those you explored with trolley tracks and bridges, will be tested, stretched, and sometimes shattered. The personal cost of moral decisions. Daniel's voice softened, almost conspiratorial, drawing the students closer despite the distance. Let me share a story. Some years ago, a young man named Alex Thompson faced a moral choice far more real than any trolley problem. Alex was a volunteer in a disaster zone, distributing food and water to families trapped by a flood. Supplies were limited, and he could either give a life-saving ration to a mother and her child or divide it among 5 strangers, giving each less than enough to survive. The students leaned in, hanging on his words. Alex chose the mother and child. The 5 survived, though weakened. Later, he questioned his decision every night. Did he choose correctly? Did he act justly? Could he have done more? Daniel looked across the room. Ethics is rarely comfortable. We live with the consequences of our choices, and we live with ourselves, the moral being who made the choice, who wrestles with guilt, doubt, and hope. Philosophy teaches us that understanding these choices is as important as the choices themselves. He let the story linger, like a shadow passing over the students' minds. Every action has ripple effects, seen and unseen. The mother and child felt Alex's compassion. The 5 strangers felt scarcity. And Alex? He carried both outcomes in his conscience. That, my students, is the true cost of living morally awake. The risk and reward of moral reflection. Daniel walked slowly along the front row, looking each student in the eye. Engaging with these questions carries risk. Personal risk, political risk, ethical risk. Yesterday you felt discomfort. Today, horror. Philosophy forces us to confront truths we might prefer to avoid. He paused, letting the words sink in. Consider the historical context. Socrates warned of similar dangers. Reflection can be destabilizing. His friend Callicles urged him to abandon philosophy, to pursue a life of conventional success, to avoid discomfort, to embrace ignorance. Emily furrowed her brow. So studying justice could make us worse off? Possibly, Daniel said. Or better off. The point is not comfort, but awakening. Philosophy estranges us from the familiar, forcing us to see life from angles we never considered. Once you see differently, you cannot unsee. You cannot unknow. Self-knowledge is like lost innocence. It changes you irrevocably. A soft murmur ran through the students. Some nodded, some looked down, reflecting on their own lives. Every law, every policy, every social rule you follow contains moral assumptions. By studying these dilemmas, you begin to recognize the hidden structure of your choices, your intuitions, your fears, and your values. Daniel returned to the center, arms open as if embracing the weight of the room. And so we return to you, the individual who must live and breathe with these decisions every day. You may never push a man off a bridge. You may never face 5 dying patients simultaneously, but you live within a moral universe, constantly making choices, seen and unseen. He smiled gently, eyes softening. This is the true aim of our journey, to awaken the restlessness of reason. To recognize that ethics is not a set of rules, but a living, breathing conversation between our hearts and minds. The bell rang, but no one moved immediately. The students sat, absorbed, thinking of trolley tracks, bridges, hearts, and livers. Thinking of themselves, of the unseen responsibilities they carried, of the quiet moral judgments made every day without applause or notice. Daniel nodded once, softly, as if acknowledging an invisible truth. We will continue this journey, question by question, story by story. And by the end, you may not have neat answers, but you will have understanding. And understanding is the first step toward wisdom. For a long moment, the hall was silent. Then slowly, students began to rise, carrying with them the weight, and perhaps the beginnings, of moral insight, balancing consequentialism and categorical ethics. Daniel returned to the center of the stage and wrote 2 words on the blackboard. Consequences and principles? Throughout our journey, you have seen these 2 forces tug at our moral intuitions. Consequentialism, championed by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, asks us to maximize happiness, minimize suffering, and consider the sum total of lives affected. It's rational, elegant, and sometimes cold. He turned to the students. Categorical ethics, championed by Immanuel Kant, demands that some acts are never permissible, no matter the outcome. It appeals to our sense of dignity, respect, and the intrinsic value of life. Emily Foster raised her hand. But Professor Carter, in the real world, don't we always have to balance them? One can't ignore consequences completely, nor principles entirely. Daniel smiled warmly. Exactly. That is the challenge. Ethics is not mathematics, nor is it simple rule-following. It is a dance, a negotiation between what we can achieve and what we ought to uphold. The dilemmas you faced with trolleys, bridges, and transplants are small simulations of much larger real-world moral landscapes. He paused, letting the weight of this sink in. And here's the lesson. Living morally awake requires restlessness. It demands that you question, reflect, and sometimes act before comfort or certainty can catch up. Philosophy does not promise easy answers. It promises clarity of mind, depth of feeling, and a sharpened conscience. The restless mind, where justice begins. Daniel stepped forward, lowering his voice as though speaking to each student individually. By now you have felt hesitation, fear, and even despair. That is not weakness. That is the awakening of reason. The discomfort, the moral unrest, is the beginning of understanding. Every moral thinker, from Aristotle to Mill, has lived in this tension, and so must you. He gestured toward the students, eyes sweeping the room with quiet intensity. Our task is not to resolve every dilemma neatly. Our task is to live with them, to see the consequences of our choices, to wrestle with the principles that guide us, and to emerge with a mind both questioning and compassionate. Marcus Blake whispered under his breath. I feel like yesterday, I would have acted one way, and today, I'm not sure at all. Daniel nodded as if reading the thought. Good. That uncertainty is the soil in which wisdom grows. Philosophy does not eliminate doubt. It teaches you to live with it, to reason through it, and to let it guide you toward justice in action. He stepped back, allowing the silence to fill the room. And remember, justice begins not with abstract principles or laws, but with you. Your choices, your conscience, your courage. Every day you will face smaller trolleys, unseen bridges, silent transplants, life demanding your moral attention. And you must respond, not because answers are simple, but because human life is sacred, complex, and infinitely valuable. The bell rang. Slowly the students rose. Some were still lost in thought. Some whispered quietly to each other. Some stared at the board, reflecting on consequences and principles. But one thing was certain. They would never think of moral choices, or themselves, the same way again. Daniel smiled faintly, his eyes glinting with quiet satisfaction. Restless minds, awake hearts, that is where justice begins. The final reflection. Understanding our moral lives. The lecture hall was quiet as the final class of the session began. Students filed in, some carrying notebooks thick with scribbles, others carrying the weight of nights spent thinking about the dilemmas they had faced. Each had wrestled with the trolley, the fat man, the transplant patient, and countless moral puzzles. Their eyes betrayed exhaustion, curiosity, and most importantly, the stirrings of self-reflection Professor Daniel Carter entered, his steps deliberate, his eyes scanning the room with a familiar calm intensity. There was no rush, no announcements, just the quiet, heavy presence of a man who had spent a lifetime studying humanity's moral struggles. "Good morning," he said softly. "Today we reach the culmination of our journey, a journey that began with hypothetical dilemmas and now arrives at a deeper understanding of the moral universe in which we live. But before we speak of rules, principles, or theories, I want to remind you of something vital. Philosophy begins and ends with the human heart." He paused, letting the words resonate. All the trolleys, bridges, and surgeries were not simply exercises in logic. They were invitations to feel, to question, to confront the reality that life is morally complex and deeply human, the interplay of principles and consequences. Daniel walked slowly across the front of the lecture hall, chalk in hand, sketching a simple diagram on the board. On one side, he wrote consequences, and on the other, principles. When we face moral choices, these two forces often pull in opposite directions. Consequentialism tells us to weigh outcomes, to save the most lives, to maximize well-being. It appeals to reason and the pragmatic side of morality. It is elegant, precise, and sometimes cold. He turned to the students, making eye contact with each one. Categorical ethics, on the other hand, reminds us that certain actions are inherently wrong. We cannot use human beings merely as a means to an end. This approach appeals to dignity, respect, and the intrinsic value of each individual. It protects us from cruelty, even when the consequences might seem beneficial. Emily Foster, sitting near the front, whispered to her neighbor, "It's like choosing between the head and the heart." Daniel smiled. "Exactly, Emily. Morality is rarely a matter of numbers or formulas. It is a living conversation between our hearts, our minds, and the world around us. And philosophy trains us to listen to that conversation, even when it is uncomfortable." He added, "The tension between consequences and principles is not a problem to be solved. It is a reality to be lived with and reflected upon. That, my students, is the essence of justice. Engaging with the real world." Daniel paused, letting the chalk hover in his hand. "Our discussions, debates, and thought experiments have one ultimate purpose: to prepare you for the real world, to equip you with the tools to make decisions that matter, sometimes in ways that cannot be measured or predicted." He walked to the center of the room. "Consider the issues facing our society: affirmative action, free speech versus hate speech, social inequality, military conscription, healthcare, and public policy. Each of these carries moral weight. Each presents dilemmas where no choice is perfectly safe or purely right." Marcus Blake, now visibly engaged, asked, "So, Professor, are we supposed to find the right answer?" Daniel shook his head gently. "No, that is not the point. The point is awareness, reflection, and the courage to act thoughtfully. Philosophy does not promise certainty. It promises depth of understanding. It teaches you to see the consequences of your choices, to respect the moral weight of every life, and to cultivate a conscience that cannot be silenced by convenience or indifference." He let the words hang in the room. "Justice is not a formula. It is a story in which each of you plays a vital role. Your actions, your decisions, your reflections, they ripple outward in ways you may never fully know. The restlessness of reason, carrying the lesson forward." Daniel stepped back from the board, his gaze sweeping across the lecture hall one final time. "If there is one lesson I hope you carry from this course, it is this: the restlessness of reason is your guide. It will unsettle you. It will challenge your assumptions. It will make you question everything you thought you knew about right and wrong, justice and injustice, life and duty. And that is a gift." He paused, his voice lowering to a tone that seemed almost intimate. "To live morally awake is to live with both courage and humility. Courage to make choices that matter. Humility to recognize the limitations of your knowledge and the weight of human suffering." The students were silent, the room heavy with thought. Each felt the moral gravity of their own lives reflected in the trolley tracks, the bridge, the hospital corridors, and the silent, unseen decisions that shape the world. "Every day," Daniel said finally, "you will face your own trolleys. Every day, bridges will appear, metaphorical or real, and you will be called upon to act. You may succeed. You may fail. But if you approach these moments with reflection, empathy, and reason, you will live a life that honors the profound moral responsibility that comes with being human." He smiled softly. "This is the end of our formal journey. But your personal journey has just begun. Go forth, question boldly, act wisely, and never stop seeking justice in yourself, in your community, and in the world. The bell rang. Students rose slowly, lingering as though they could take a moment longer to absorb the profound truth of the lecture. As they left, they carried more than notes and books. They carried the weight and the awakening of reason itself. And with that, Professor Daniel Carter quietly gathered his chalk and stepped out, leaving the room filled with students ready to live morally awake, guided by justice, and conscious of the profound consequences of every choice.